Okay, hi everyone. So I'm gonna give a very bad presentation. And I was on Wednesday morning, I was trying to decide. I hadn't even thought about what I wanted to say or the abstract I had written. And I was trying to decide what would be the least impolite thing to do, or whether to withdraw myself from the program or whether to give it a try and say something. So you decide for yourselves and tell me which one it will have been. I hope you don't suffer from this. So yeah, so let me just read out the abstract first, so that you know the context of in which or from which these thoughts have emerged. So my intention is to write something like a critical, like a Heidegger critique of the Stoics. So the title is Heidegger against the Stoics on mindfulness and uncanny feelings. And the chapter is meant to compare and contrast two competing models of mindfulness, a Heideggerian model and a Stoic model, focusing on the way they respectively theorize affective states and the normative ideal of well-being, thus delineating opposing stances and therapeutic options regarding extremely negative or uncanny feelings, uh, namely angst, anxiety. The first section will clarify the Stoic idea of the sage and the ideal of freedom from emotions, apatheia. Emotions will be theorized using a cognitivist model and will be identified as products of bad judgment, which must and can be eliminated cognitively. Then the section will analyze the naturalist principle of oikeiōsis, appropriation or familiarization, as the telos of mindfulness, which permeates the whole process of becoming sage. The second section will look at Heidegger's early phenomenology and will argue that in being and time, the Heideggerian sage, the human being that exists authentically, let's say, is someone who does not try to overcome anxiety, which is intrinsically tied to the feeling of uncanniness or unhomeliness, but rather cultivates a comportment that embraces these emotions, this Stimmung. Here, the sage is called to own up to their latent angst and sense of unhomeliness, a feeling that amounts to a philosophical destination and which rehabilitates the human being's existential condition and its well-being, bringing it back to its unsettled inner nature. Finally, the Heideggerian model of mindfulness will be conceived along the lines of phronetic prudence, opposed to a cognitivist reflective model that characterizes Stoic mindfulness. That's my abstract, and now what I thought about this abstract. And it's not technical, I'm afraid, and there are no references. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'll start by saying that I had underestimated how much work organizing this conference would involve, and I thought I would have time in the last week to write something. However, this was not the case. So it's Thursday, June 2nd, 6 a.m. as I'm writing these lines. So I will present to you the general idea of where I want to go with this paper and see if I can raise some issues that I find troubling and in need to resolve. My initial idea for the paper, the initial intention, was to compare and contrast two approaches, two ways of thinking about mindfulness, the Heideggerian and the Stoic, which amount to two entirely different viewpoints that at a first glance are entirely incompatible with one another, so much so that it would seem as a fruitless task. The incompatibility between the Heideggerian project and the Stoic project is so glaring that it is even impossible to be made manifested, as you cannot compare two entirely different projects that have different aims and that operate on a different register. For example, it will indeed involve so much hermeneutic violence exerted onto Heidegger's philosophy that one can easily object that my take of Heidegger, at least for the purposes of this paper, is not just controversial, but it is un-Heideggerian, entirely outside the spirit of Heidegger's ontological project. To begin with, Heidegger's philosophy is not in any way connected or reducible to a practical philosophy or any sort of self-help philosophy that aims at offering a way of life or describing a particular way of life, or that can offer any therapeutic advice for any psychological issues one may have, and in particular emotional issues. Another problem would be to try and squeeze out the notion of mindfulness that would resemble the practice of mindfulness close to what, for example, Kabat-Zinn describes. Although, as several papers have by now pointed out, that despite the differences and the seeming impossibility to develop a version of mindfulness from within Heidegger's philosophy is not an impossible task. You probably have to move the goalposts in terms of what counts as mindfulness. But if you do, then you can reconstruct a Heideggerian version of mindfulness. From the perspective of Stoicism now, one has to engage in a bit of revisionism in order to identify a notion of mindfulness in Stoicism. While I think, and I'm not an expert, thankfully there is an expert here and he can completely demolish me. While Stoicism shares the practical character as well as the therapeutic application with mindfulness, the connection is still not as straightforward. As regards Stoic's philosophy connection to Heideggerian phenomenology, again, one has to concede that there isn't anything transcendental about Stoicism or any version of an ontological difference, which is so central to Heidegger's philosophy. Although I'm going to complicate things more and more, because I mean, I have read a chapter by Wayne Martin, who is at Essex, who he wrote a chapter which is, I think, is entitled something like Stoic Transcendentalism, where he argues that the Stoics might have some sort of proto-transcendental argument, and he thinks the process of oikeiōsis, of appropriation, is a version of transcendentalism. It might be the first time there is something like a transcendental argument being made. I'm not sure I'm convinced by it, but I'm just trying to show that you always have someone arguing the opposite of what is the standard view. Okay, right. Yeah. So why then would someone go ahead and compare and contrast these two approaches? On what basis and with what philosophical justification? I raised a set of general objections as regards the compatibility or comparability even of Heidegger's philosophy to Stoicism. These are, I'll enumerate them, and I'm not sure I'm following them systematically as I'm developing the paper. The first one is the irreducibility of Heidegger's ontology to a practical philosophy. The second one is the irreducibility to a therapeutic application. The third is the irreducibility of the ontological to the ontic, because speaking very crudely, the Heidegger's project is ontological. There's nothing ontological in the Heideggerian sense. In the Stoics, it's an ontic philosophy. I haven't mastered an analytic response to these objections, but this is a preliminary response that I would give. So I would firstly counter-object with this, that while the ontological register in Heidegger is never reducible to the ontic, and while the analytic of Dasein is not reducible to a psychology or a sociology of Dasein, and while fundamental moods in being and time, the Grundstimmungen, are not reducible to emotions, and Heidegger repeats this all the time, and while also the praxial being character of Dasein, the ontological mode of Zuhandenheit, okay, it's an elliptical sentence. I would say that still the analytic of Dasein has to presuppose and begin with a version of the ontic, so with a certain ontical character, ontical presuppositions, ontic descriptions. there is no ontology without the ontic. So being in time is also a story of the ontic that becomes ontological, the non-philosophical, non-phenomenological that becomes phenomenological, the inauthentic that becomes authentic. To repeat this more correctly, it involves a description of the pre-authentic that becomes authentic, the pre-phenomenological that becomes phenomenological, and so on and so forth. And therefore, Heidegger has to somehow inherit and repeat ontic philosophies, ontic theories, ontic anthropologies, ontic sociologies, or presuppositions that derive and biases that come from that register. So he inherits, in this context, he inherits a particular theory of emotion from Aristotle, or so he says, and I'll say more things on this later, which he will ontologize. So he inherits a specific understanding of fear that he will ontologize or will analyze in terms of ontology, and a whole lot of other ontic structures. He cannot even begin being in time without a version of the ontic. And even if the pre-ontological ontic is nowhere to be found in his text, it is a precondition that needs to be in the reader's, that this needs to be in the reader's head, in his or her mind, in order for Heidegger's text to do any ontological work and to have any meaning. To put it in more specific and concrete terms, if the reader of Being and Time doesn't read Stimmung, mood, and doesn't initially think of the psychological, mundane, ontic version of moods and emotions, then there is no transformative power in Heidegger's text. To put it otherwise, if Heidegger's admiration for Aristotle's discoveries regarding affectivity means that he thinks that Aristotle had said everything there was to be said about emotions and their ontological power, then it's as if he would be saying or assuming that Aristotle had already given us a complete description, a complete ontological version of Dasein, which would render Heidegger's ontology as unnecessary. It is therefore important for Heidegger scholarship to examine Heidegger's anthropological presupposition and the related theory of emotions he's operating with at the ontic level, which would amount to looking at how close or how far his theory would be from the Stoic theory of emotions. At least that's what I want to do. So there are several hypotheses I made based on it. So these are my initial hypotheses or biases that I had in my mind when I initially thought of this abstract or this idea, this project, this essay. So there were several hypotheses I had made based on established understanding or misunderstanding and interpretations of the Stoic and of Heidegger. And some of them collapse upon scrutiny, I think, others not. And I will lay some of them down now, and this is what I'm going to do for the rest of the paper. I'm just going to raise some complications I'm finding out, in which I don't know exactly how to resolve or where it's going. So the general initial hypothesis that guided my paper or my proposal, my abstract, was quite simple, and it was this. There is a rejuvenation of Stoic philosophy lately, internationally, which is being appropriated or reappropriated by people working in cognitive behavioral therapy, just CBT. Just like CBT has been successfully married with Buddhist-inspired versions of mindfulness, like Jon Kabat-Zinn's. Likewise, CBT can also be married with Stoic philosophy and have produced a Stoic version of mindfulness. But the appropriation has come from the other side too, or has taken place from the other side too, namely that Stoic philosophers have also been trying to repurpose Stoic philosophy so as to develop a Stoic version of mindfulness. And I think there are some papers where they focus on the notion of prosauche. I don't know how you translate it, attention. Yeah. And I cannot judge whether that's accurate from within Stoic philosophy or not. So what is the theoretical basis that allows this marriage to take place? It is a shared cognitivist or one of the theoretical bases. It is a shared cognitivist theory of emotions and the possibility of a cognitively based therapy. There is also a shared practical interest in the ideal of freedom from passions, apatheia, specifically negative stressful emotions such as fear and anxiety, as well as a shared interest in the establishment or re-establishment of harmony, of the individual being in harmony with the environment, with the world, with nature, the overcoming of alienation and defamiliarization, and the feeling of not being at home in the world. In other words, the practical aim of oikeiōsis. Heidegger, on the other hand, at least the early Heidegger of Being and Time, not only considers these negative emotions, specifically fear and anxiety, as important, rather, they are indispensable to the whole project of ontological awakening. The authentic Dasein must be anxious. Of course, Heidegger is not consistent or about whether he, so it's unclear whether he thinks in Being and Time that one can become authentic via other moods, or whether anxiety is the primordial mood and there is no other, and namely that's the only way to become authentic. So anxiety, so Dasein must be anxious. Anxiety is the fundamental mood in Being and Time, and defamiliarization, the sense of uncanniness, being uncanny even, is a necessary precondition in order to attain authentic understanding and become authentic. So it's not something you're trying to escape. It's something you go towards. So it's at the first glance, it's like the opposite movement. If you compare where the Stoics are trying to go and where Heidegger of Being and Time is trying to go, trying to do. To use the vocabulary that Min-Hong Chu used yesterday, which is appropriate here, or some of it, anxiety and uncanniness are methodologically necessary so as to enact the shift from the mundane to the transcendental, from the ontic to the ontological. What is more, for Heidegger, emotions, affects are not cognitivist appraisals, rather they have their own peculiar mode of disclosure. To rephrase it better, they are a mode of disclosure that exceeds or precedes cognition and intuition too, because he says they are not anschaungen, it's not Anschauung. And Befindlichkeit or state of mind is, as Heidegger disposition, is, as Heidegger says in Being and Time, equiprimordial to understanding, verstehen, and hence irreducible to understanding. And so, and I think everything cognitive would fall on the side of understanding, if I'm not wrong. And so at the first glance, or judgment would be an operation of understanding. And so at the first glance, Heidegger would seem to be the opposing pole to the Stoic approach, where the Stoic would use a version of mindfulness as therapy for passions such as fear and anxiety, and specifically fear connected to death, fear of death. The early Heidegger would have a version of mindfulness, resoluteness, that would seek to enact, awaken, and embrace fear of death, anxiety, and the uncanny as, let's say, a form of therapy from the forgetfulness of being, from metaphysics, from the malady of inauthenticity and the sheer ontic. Right, so now I'm gonna say a few things that I think undermine some of these presuppositions that I have mentioned. So to what extent is this understanding of the Stoics justified? Looking at the Stoics more carefully, one realizes that the picture, or the history rather, is much more complicated. And the initial hypothesis, or my initial hypothesis, which is, I think, what many people assume is the case, is too simplistic. To begin with, there isn't a unified theory of emotions in Stoicism, so one has to clarify which Stoics one means. It is true that modern cognitive therapy has many things in common with Stoic therapy, but the kind of therapy they approach also depends on the underlying theory of emotion, of what one takes an emotion to be. So if you don't know what an emotion is, how will you work with it or to eliminate it? You need an approach that would be based on a definition. For example, there is the question of the relation between emotion and cognition, and emotion and judgment. There is no agreement among the Stoics on this, even though there is a standard view, or the most established view, which is, I think, Chrysippus's view, which differs from Zeno's view. Let me begin by saying that when the Stoics refer to emotion, they are referring to pathos, to passion. So the notion of passion is not exactly the same thing as what we mean when we say emotion nowadays. And indeed, they all agree that passions are pernicious and should be eradicated so as to achieve a state of apatheia, as opposed to, say, Aristotle's metriopatheia. However, since passion is not identical to the modern notion of emotion, and some emotions are not passions, one needs to ask whether the Stoic sage can indeed feel some emotions, or whether he or she will be totally emotionless. So if the passions do not, if emotions are a bigger category than passions, and you get rid of passions, then you might be left with some emotions that are fine to be experienced, and that you don't need to get rid of, and you don't need therapy for them. According to Zeno, passions are not so much about a mistaken judgment, but rather they emerge when one goes against one's own true and better judgment. And so passions are inappropriate phenomena that signify that one is going against one's own rational nature, that one is disobedient to his or her reason. So passions are not bad judgments for Zeno, or appraisals themselves, although they are implicated with judgment, insofar as one judges that, say, X is useful or wrong, and yet one, so if one, yes, and yet one disobeys their reason and avoids it while it has judged that it's useful, or they go ahead and do it against the judgment that it is wrong to do. So going against the judgment. The definition ascribed to Zeno is that passions are movements of the soul. It is a kinetic or somatic phenomenon, and in that respect, insofar as passions refer to something kinetic, that's my word. I don't know if it's okay to use it in this context. Huh? Is it? Okay, great. Okay. It is insofar as it is, in that respect, insofar as passions refer to something kinetic, I'm not sure how far away it would be from what Heidegger is trying to describe with moods and plasticity in being and time. However, for Zeno, passions are movements of the soul contrary to nature, rational nature. Heidegger would never agree with this, quite the opposite. Where Zeno privileges the rational capacities of the soul, Heidegger privileges, I think, the affective. So that's debatable. Given Zeno's definitions of emotion, passion, where does this leave us in terms of freedom from emotions and apatheia? Does it mean that the ideal human being, the sage, is totally emotionless, Not really, because it is possible to feel emotions that are in line with rational judgment, which would mean they are not passions anymore. They're not passions per se. They are not irrational impulses. They are emotions that are appropriate and in line with judgment. The other important, how much time do I have? Oh, I thought, okay. The other important Stoic to refer to here, apart from Zeno, is Chrysippus, who has developed the standard view of emotions. According to Chrysippus, emotions are identified with evaluative judgments. They consist of evaluative judgments. For every emotion involves two distinct evaluative judgments. The first judgment concerns the judgment of whether something is good or bad, and the other, the second judgment, concerns whether it is appropriate, kathekon, to react to it. While for Chrysippus, therapy from passions would involve some form of cognitive modification, for Zeno, it is not necessarily a modification of judgment, but our relation to judgment that makes a difference, because it may be the case that the judgment is correct and the passion arises not because the value judgment is wrong, but because we go against the judgment and disobey it. So one false presupposition we have regarding Chrysippus's position is that he aims at the total eradication of emotions, which is not true, I find. There is such a thing as the so-called apatheia, the good emotions, let's say, or the good passions, that are appropriate for one to feel. For example, the sage would feel joy when in the presence of good things and when living in accordance with nature and truth. And it would be an appropriate emotion for the sage to feel, as it would not be a passion, really. Here, one needs to point out that Heidegger himself in Being and Time refers to joy as a mood that one feels when authentic, so when the truth of being has been disclosed. And I don't think we discuss often about the mood of joy and how it's this peculiar mood that when one is authentically anxious, but also joyful because of the connection with truth, which is, I think, something he inherits. It's a theory of emotions that he inherits from the past. So it's nothing new, really. So even the Stoics had it. Another false belief we have about Chrysippus regarding the emotion of fear, and specifically fear of death, is the reason it is irrational to fear death is because death falls within the sphere of indifference and hence does not fall within the sphere of ethics, as it is neither good nor evil. It is not something we can control, we cannot do something about it. So it is standard to assume that from Chrysippus's perspective, fear of death is irrational and hence one needs to overcome it as an emotion by way of cognitive modification, so as to get rid of the false belief involved, of course. But not only about fear, but also the same holds for anxiety too. But is this entirely true? It's not, I think, because the passion of fear or anxiety has a rational version, which is the product of true belief, of knowledge, and of an appropriate response to it. This means that there is a fairly wide scope of emotions that the sage can have, consistent with the veridical assessment of the values of good and indifferent around him or her. And so I can imagine that the Stoics or the Chrysipian approach, there could be a way to experience anxiety as a proper emotion, but I'm not sure it would be necessarily connected to death or how it would be. So the equivalent, the rational equivalent of anxiety or fear is what Chrysippus calls caution, which would be the rational equivalent of desire or fear. So I said that. So it would not be a passion anymore, but a selection, an ekloge. So if the sage judges truly and appropriately according to reason, that he or she chooses to, then he or she chooses to feel cautious, i.e., be appropriately afraid or anxious about an object or event. In this regard, we need to more carefully contrast it with Heideggerian authenticity, insofar as authenticity involves resolutely owning up to one's anxiety. Of course, it is not a matter of judgment in the Stoic sense, but there is a notion of decision and childhood involved in being and time, and therefore angst authentically experienced is no longer a matter of brute affect, but it does involve understanding and some form of appraisal. It's not cognitive, but there is some form of appraisal involved. Otherwise, the mood would not be able to do any of the work it is doing. And therefore, a comparison between Heidegger and the Stoics is a more complicated thing than I initially had thought it would. So, indeed, in Being and Time, moods, Befindlichkeit is distinct from Verstehen, understanding, where a function of which is judgment, but it is always already implicated in it. And Dasein cannot have sheer Stimmung or Befindlichkeit that is not always already co-determined or co-constituted by Verstehen, and perhaps by judgment too, at least at the derivative level. Finally, let me briefly mention another unwarranted presupposition regarding Heidegger's connections to the Stoics, especially his theory of emotions, the one he inherited, Being and Time. In Being and Time, Heidegger argues more or less that Aristotle had said everything there was to be said about emotions, and that since Aristotle, there was no progress made as regards emotions. For a long time, I myself believed that, and always looked at Aristotle and the homologies between Heidegger and Aristotle in order to interpret his understanding of moods. 5 years ago, at a conference I organized when I was UCD, and Dermot Moran had given a paper, and he had argued that Heidegger borrowed heavily from Scheler, if I remember. Is that what you had there? And indeed, he's right. It took me a while to realize it. And I had initially undermined that. But if we follow that line, that genealogy, we find Augustine. And then that heavily influenced Being and Time's focus on fear and anxiety, and of course, St. Paul. So the focus on fear and anxiety in their togetherness with guilt. And behind Augustine, we find the Stoic theory of emotion. We encounter Posidonius's objections to Chrysippus and the introduction of the notion of first movements, the propathia, that were postulated in order to defend Chrysippus against the objections of Posidonius. It's a complicated story, and I'm not sure I got it right, but this is where my sense. So Posidonius had objected that one can have emotions without, against the argument that one can have emotions. No, sorry, he had objected that to Chrysippus that one can have emotions without judgment, as is the case of music, with music, for example. In order to accommodate that, the Chrysipian theory, the idea of first movement, i.e. of pre-rational or pre-reflective passion, was introduced, which Augustine, if I'm not wrong, incorporated in his own theory of emotions, which he connected them with sins, though, I think. So he connected guilt with passions. That is, I'm not sure it's mediated by reason. And here I want to wonder how close this is to Heidegger's own presuppositions and his theory, the tacit theory of emotions he's operating with in Being and Time, which comes from a theological context. But ultimately, following doing a genealogy, I think you will find that he has inherited something from the Stoic. And I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much.